Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com. Today I'm actually going to do a different type of drawing that I haven't tried before. I don't normally do goblins or fairies in general, but I decided to give it a try for this image. So it's something a little bit different than what I'm used to. So I did look at some reference before I actually started this because it is something that I haven't drawn before. And even if it's something I have drawn before, I do tend to rely fairly heavily on my referencing either way, especially for human anatomy. But in this case, because it is a goblin, although it is going to be based off human anatomy in general, some of the proportions for the character will be different because it is a fantasy type creature. And nobody really knows what an actual goblin looks like. So I do have a lot more liberty in the design process when it is a fantasy creature like this. There's normally some general rules of thumb that you need to keep in mind, but overall I find it a lot easier to work on, normally because I have so much leeway in how I interpret the character. I did not actually start out with a plan for this image. I literally went straight to digital painting. Normally I do some traditional thumbnails for the character, but this time I just wanted to keep it loose and see where I went with the image. So once I figured out the initial pose, I had to make sure that whatever background I put the character on would be appropriate for that pose. Normally it is the reverse, or normally I take into account the background before I actually start posing out the character. And I'll normally do thumbnails associated to that to make sure that it'll work. But in this case, because I was just trying to keep this loose and not pre-planned, I decided to work the background around the character. Now, I did decide that when I finished about the torso area, that I was going to probably put this character on a tree. So by that point, I did have a fairly good idea of probably what the background was going to look like. Even though it's a spontaneous drawing, I'm normally thinking ahead, thinking, oh, okay, this pose kind of looks like he would be hanging on a tree, or maybe sitting on it. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. Is once I figured out the upper torso, I decided that I definitely wanted to have him sitting in a tree. It's a good place to hide, so if I was a fantasy creature like this, and I was very small, that's probably the place I would hide. So that's the main reason why he's sitting in a tree in this illustration. So once I figure out the initial sketch idea and the pose, what I generally do is I start adding in some very basic lights and shadows so that I can turn off my line art as soon as possible. By doing that, I don't get distracted by the line art, and I can see exactly how light or how dark certain portions are. And at this point here is where I actually started turning it off and just working purely with the shadows to make sure that it read all the shapes and anatomy read correctly. Now the main focus in any character is normally the face area, so it does have to be rendered more fully than the rest of the body. For this reason, I started off with the face to make sure that his emotional state read fairly clearly. I also wanted to figure out more fully what the details of the face would actually be. So once I figured out the face, or the majority of the face structure, I began working on the arms and the torso. These are the general areas that I normally work on first because there's a lot of structure involved. The anatomy is very difficult to figure out initially, but once you figure it out, it's pretty easy afterwards. So normally it's a pretty good starting point for me. It's also closer to the face. Because it is closer to the face, I know I'm going to have to add a bit more detail than the rest of the body itself. The further you move away from the face, the less detail you actually have to add in order for it to read correctly. So do keep that in mind when I'm actually doing the initial drawing. Now you can see I'm trying to fully figure out how the anatomy itself would be properly structured. He's a goblin, and in this case I drew him fairly lengthy. So he's pretty much, I took all the normal human anatomy and I stretched it out to the extreme in certain cases, especially for the ears. By doing that, it gives the character a much more foreign look, yet it's also a very familiar look too. So it does remind us of ourselves as humans, but it also has that unknown to it and that the lack of understanding, because we don't know really what it is. What is this guy capable of? Does he have magic? Is he very limble? Does he survive by being really fast? He has small muscle tone, so he most likely is very fast in general. So I do look at those aspects of a character before I actually start fully rendering it out. And as I'm working too, I'm going to fine-tune certain areas to make sure that those messages do come across properly as well. Now I do start generally with the grayscale first. The reason why I do start with the grayscale is it helps me set up the proper anatomy structure without putting too much time into it. It's a lot easier to add the color on top of it than it is to do vice versa. Because once I have the structure in there, it's just a matter of tweaking maybe the layers above it in order to achieve the look that I'm looking for. You also notice that with this drawing, I actually started off with the background first. The reason why I did that is it provided me with some of the tones that I needed. It also gave me a texture to work from. So I wasn't working with a blank canvas. Sometimes it can be a little daunting to work with a blank canvas. If you do have problems working with a blank canvas, then it's normally a pretty good idea to actually start coloring in the background first. Now, once I finish doing the character, I start working on the background for this character. So once again, I just block this in roughly to figure out the basic structure of the branch that the character is going to be sitting on. At this point, I have decided he's definitely going to be on the branch. So I do work the branch around his current pose. So I just add my basic values once again to make sure that it reads correctly. And basic structure. I'm not adding too much detail on the branch, and I don't need to, mainly because the character itself doesn't have overly large amounts of detail, and as it's receding anyway, the branch would become less and less detailed. Now once the basic branch design is figured out, or I add another layer, which is my basic color palette for this piece. Once the basic color palette has been established, I'll create once again another layer and I'll start adding in some additional colors and highlights on the character to make sure he reads properly. Now in the shadows there's generally a bit more blue colors that are normally visible, so for this reason I added some blue colors into the shadows. I also made sure that certain limbs read correctly, so I added some additional highlights and tones to it, some reds and some brighter yellows to make sure that the character really did pop and wasn't mistaken as part of the branch itself. By adding very light yellow as well, I'm able to bring out certain details that are normally hidden too. So it's a really easy way to add some more structure into the image and also to make sure that certain parts are defined properly. Now for the eyes, because he is a goblin, so I'm not making him totally evil, but I'm also not making him to be the nicest guy around. So for this reason, I did give him red eyes. Red also helps draw your attention towards his face because it's a different color than the rest of the piece. So it helps draw the viewer's eye towards the character. Now I do spend quite a bit of time fine-tuning some of the colors that are on the character by making sure there's enough highlights and enough detail that is shown, especially in the light areas. In the light areas you generally have more detail, and for that reason I am making sure that those areas are more detailed than the rest of the piece. I also duplicated my grayscale image for this. Now the only downside with doing that is certain areas became way too dark. So all I did was create a mask layer above it and masked out certain areas to make sure that they didn't turn certain areas completely black, or it didn't look odd. Now once the basic shadows are added in, once again I add shadows to make sure that the character is properly grounded within the piece. I begin adding some of the foreground details that you see. Now he's in a tree, so there would be bushes, shrubs, foliage around him, and for this reason I'm adding the leaves. Now I didn't want the background to be completely bare, so what I did do is I added 2 tiny hints of characters in the background and hinted at some more branches as well. They're very light in this video, unfortunately, but in the final piece you can actually see them a lot better. So this is my Goblin illustration. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I found this to be a very enjoyable piece to work on, so I might actually do this in the future as well. Thank you for tuning in, and take care.